All right, thank you all for joining Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center's third annual instant analysis of the governor's budget proposal. I'm Marc Stier, I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. I'm joined today by Reesa Kossoff, who's the executive director of SEIU State Council of Pennsylvania, by Susan Spicka, who's the executive director of Education Voters, and by Morgan Plant, who's a longtime progressive lobbyist for many causes that we all support, and one of our experts who we turn to for our understanding of Pennsylvania politics. Governor presented his 2021-22 budget under the cloud of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still afflicting our state and our country, which has created a deep economic recession, and also under the cloud of many other things that have happened in the last year, particularly protests against police violence and general broader recognition of the extent to which white supremacy still afflicts our country. In response, the governor's proposed a budget that addresses a number of issues: taxes, education, wages, and criminal justice. That is, in our view, a real response to the current situation and also to some of the long-term inequities that have afflicted our society. We believe his proposal will begin to break down the economic, racial, gender, and immigration status inequities that have for too long have limited the ability of many Pennsylvanians to thrive. I'm going to ask each of our presenters to look at one particular part of the budget, then I'll talk a little bit about taxes, and then we'll throw it open to questions. So we're going to start with Reesa Kossoff, who's going to be talking about the minimum wage proposal in the budget.
Thank you so much, Mark, and hello to all of my fellow panelists, and hello to everybody on Facebook Live. I always feel honored. It's become a yearly tradition to spend the afternoon of the governor's budget address with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center crew. And unfortunately, it's become too much of a habit for me to talk about minimum wage specifically, because we still have not raised it in Pennsylvania in 14 years, which is absolutely absurd and unacceptable. I want to start my comments by couching the need to increase the minimum wage in the things that we face as a Commonwealth at the moment. For almost a year, one month from today, will be at the year anniversary for which we have been asking Pennsylvania's lowest wage earners to do the hardest and most difficult jobs, and the jobs where they have risked their very lives in the middle of this pandemic to keep Pennsylvania's basic services afloat and operational. And it is an absolute disgrace that we are asking hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians to do this type of work at $7.25 per hour. I've said this in many years now. There's a moral imperative to raise the wage here in Pennsylvania. And now that you are having Pennsylvanians risk life and limb in order to keep our basic services afloat, it's unacceptable, and we have to move forward. The governor's proposal today is the proposal that we have heard for many, many years, and it becomes increasingly important. Moving the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2027, then indexing the minimum wage to inflation so that we don't keep having to have this discussion and wait a decade, more than a decade, to increase the minimum wage. To lift preemption, to give our municipalities and counties the ability to go ahead and determine the floor wages within their own localities and being able to serve the workers in various parts of the state. And then, of course, making sure that we actually have one fair wage to make sure that we're not creating a separate category of workers who are existing on $2.13 an hour, thanks to the inequitable tipped wage that Pennsylvanians unfortunately are still subject to. So all of those things combined are hugely important to get done. If folks will remember, there was some motion on minimum wage in the 2019-2020 General Assembly session by which the Senate moved to a $9.50 minimum wage, and that actually passed out of that chamber. Wasn't nearly enough, let me be extraordinarily clear. But there was movement. It did come at the expense of reneging on overtime regulations. Now, of course, When that went to the House, it went to die. So we didn't even get that $9.50. On the flip side, that does mean that those overtime regulations, which increase overtime pay for tens of thousands of Pennsylvanians, did go into place. So that's the upside of that debate. But we are still mired in poverty wages. I want to make some additional notes about the national context of this. In Florida, even in a year where that state voted very conservative at the top of the ticket, Floridians overwhelmingly passed a $15 minimum wage via a ballot initiative. If a state like Florida can pass that with their electorate, there's absolutely no excuse for Pennsylvania not doing the same thing. In addition, there is going to be a massive push for a federal minimum wage of 15 that is part of President Biden's COVID relief proposal that will hopefully start moving in the halls of Congress very, very quickly here. So it is beyond time for us to be taking action on this issue in Pennsylvania. And no doubt it'll be a push again this year. It's time to get up. It's time to do this. It's beyond morally objectionable to allow our hardest working Pennsylvanians doing our most dangerous jobs to be making poverty wages. So I'll end it there. Mark, turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Reesa. I'm just going to add two things on this. One is that when we get to $15 an hour, over 1.6 million Pennsylvanians will have gotten a raise. That's a quarter of the workforce, and that's pretty extraordinary. I don't think people realize how many low-paid workers there are. Some of those people who get a raise would be people who are making under 15. Some are people who are making over 15 and will see their wages pushed up as businesses bid to keep the workers they have. It will also add $6 billion to the Pennsylvania economy. That's wages that creates buying power that'll help local businesses recover from the recession and thrive. So that it's a contribution to everyone, not just the workers who get an increase in the wage. We're going to turn over to Susan Spicka now to talk about education policy in the governor's budget proposal. Oh, you're muted, Susan.
Thanks for inviting me to be on this. I feel like Reesa, it's an honor to be part of this every single year. Governor Wolf's education, so we have all seen, because of COVID, the inequities in Pennsylvania's school funding system that were maybe kind of covered up before COVID were really laid bare. And Governor Wolf's budget responds to the moment and really takes steps toward reducing the inequities in school funding and resources available to students. So Governor Wolf has proposed a historic investment of more than $1.5 billion into basic and special education funding. This investment would substantially increase resources available to students in the most profoundly underfunded school districts, and it would make progress toward closing resources and opportunity gaps that are harming the most vulnerable students and that are actually threatening our future workforce, our tax base, and the economy. So for basic education, which is the largest pot of money, Governor Wolf has proposed to run all of the current funding through the basic education funding formula, which was enacted in 2016. This is a formula that takes into account student factors and gives extra weight and extra funding to school districts based on the actual needs of students in their districts. So if you have more students with poverty, more students with English language learners, there's a little extra funding that goes to that. And it also takes into account the ability of the community to raise its own revenue at the local level, because in many cases in Pennsylvania, it's the poorest communities that have the highest property taxes because they have to raise money and they don't have a robust tax base to raise funding off of. So the basic education funding formula is a very good formula, but up until this year, only 11% of school funding went through it. So the impact of the formula has been minimal. So Governor Wolf's proposal would put $1.1 billion of new funding into the basic education funding line item to ensure that no school district would lose money when all of the money goes through the formula. So that is invested, everybody is level, all the money is going through the formula. And then on top of that, there is a $200 million investment that ensures that all school districts will get an increase, and all school districts in Pennsylvania need an increase. And so while this is a historic investment, this does not come close to closing the gap of funding that is necessary for public schools, but it does take a huge step toward ensuring that the school districts that need the most will be getting substantial increases. Governor Wolf has also proposed a $200 million increase in special education funding. And just to put that in context, between 2008 and 9 and 2018-19, the state increased special education funding for school districts by $110 million, while special education costs for school districts increased by $2 billion. So this $200 million increase in special education funding is a very large increase, but again, it's only like taking a step toward what we need, but it will be very welcome. Governor Wolf is also proposing to like really tighten up the finances and looking at the available dollars and how money is being spent and making sure that it's being spent better. So he has proposed some charter school funding reforms. So, you know, I think it's pretty clear that cyber charter schools, when they're being paid the same as brick and mortar charter schools, that they're just getting way more money than they're spending educating kids, and that results in just a lot of money being wasted. So Governor Wolf is proposing a flat rate for cyber charter school tuition of $9,500 so that the tuition that's paid to cyber charter schools will more closely match their actual costs. He is also proposing to apply the special education funding formula to all charter schools, because right now the amount of money that charter schools receive has absolutely no relation to the cost of services for students with disabilities. So a school district could be paying over $50,000 in tuition for a student who is receiving a half an hour a week of speech therapy. And in many cases, there are charter schools that are reaping enormous profits off of students with disabilities and then taking special education funding and repurposing it for things like CEO salaries and advertising. And so that needs to end. So Governor Wolf proposed charter school reforms would save school districts $229 million. Those are necessary. He has proposed $200 million for the PlanCon project, which reimburses school districts for new construction projects. He's also proposed a $1 billion expansion of the Development Assistance Capital Program grant program so that school districts can apply for grants to remediate toxic conditions in their buildings. I mean, a lot of schools have not been able to reopen since the pandemic because they don't have ventilation systems that can create a safe environment. And so that needs to be remediated, and Governor Wolf has a plan to help with that. There are also there are scholarships that he has proposed for students who attend the state-owned PASHE system, Pennsylvania State Association of Higher Education. So right now, Pennsylvania spends about $200 million a year in slot tax dollars that are collected. It gets funneled to the Racehorse Development Fund, where about 90% of it is used to provide cash prizes to wealthy horse owners in the Racehorse Development Fund. You know, about half of that money ends up being paid to people who don't even live in Pennsylvania. So Governor Wolf has proposed that instead of providing cash prizes to wealthy horse owners, we take the slots tax dollars that are collected by the Commonwealth and we use that money to provide scholarships to students who are attending public universities. And you know, just of note, Pennsylvania has such inadequate funding for public higher education that our students graduate from college have some of the highest debt of anybody in the nation, and it's really, students are being priced out of being able to go to college. And so if we want nurses, if we want teachers, if we want people who are going to be qualified to work in our communities and so that we can have a strong economy, we need to do something about higher education. And this is a really good way of just repurposing tax dollars that are just being wasted and investing in students instead. And then there's just one other small thing. We have these tax credit programs that provide scholarships to students who attend private schools. So businesses divert their money away from the Treasury and into scholarship organizations. It's about $200 million a year. There is absolutely no academic or financial accountability for how this money is spent, and the scholarship organizations that receive the tax dollars from businesses are allowed to keep 20% of the money that they get. And so Governor Wolf has proposed reducing that 20% that these scholarship organizations get to skim off, to reducing that to just 5%, and that would actually create $36 million that could be used to fund scholarships for students in private schools. And then he's also proposing many more accountability standards so that we know that this money that is going to these scholarship organizations is actually being spent wisely. So it's a very robust education proposal, really deserves the support of Pennsylvanians. Turn it back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Susan. Now I'm going to turn it over to Morgan Plant. I've asked Morgan to talk about human services, where she has a great deal of expertise, and some other parts of the budget where she may not have as much expertise, but I know she can figure this out as well as anyone. So thanks very much, Morgan, for joining us. I think you're muted.
My apologies. Thank you for inviting me once again to participate. I love PBGC. I think we all depend on you for good thinking on a lot of topics that we care about. And I'm sitting here with many different pieces of paper on my desk to try and provide as much of an overview as I can. And I'll be glad to take questions afterwards. But and I want to say that the governor's education proposal is mind-blowing. In terms of going big, here's hoping. We have a lot of work to do to try and get that through. But I will start actually with the part of the budget that I am sort of least familiar with, but I did have some help. Mark, thank you for helping with talking points. So we had a program called Restore PA, which has been sort of repurposed as, I think, Back to Work PA. And this is a $3 billion fund to help workers and businesses stabilize the economy because of the impact of COVID. And that the money from this would come from an extraction tax on the shale industry, which, as you all may know, has been an ongoing battle between the governor and the Republicans in the legislature. The plan is basically to provide a rapid injection of dollars so that we will hopefully come out of the COVID pandemic with a stronger and more robust workforce. In many respects, I think this is aspirational, but we're going to do the best that we can. It does direct investment into training and childcare. Those are two of the 5 barriers that have been identified by the Keystone Economic Development Workforce Command Center. It's sort of a reshoring initiative of prioritizing and recapitalizing existing programs. And making strategic investments in municipalities to prevent distress status through the Department of Community and Economic Development. Hopefully it will help move Pennsylvanians from jobs that have been lost during the pandemic and into permanent jobs in the future. This would come from bonds that would be repaid by a severance tax. So moving on to some of the other things in the budget, there is an additional $1 million for legal services for low-income individuals and families. I think particularly because of how people have been impacted by COVID. There's an additional $1 million to provide direct care worker training in the participated directed model. There's $1.25 million to discharge 20 individuals from, for many years now, we have been trying to draw down the census in state institutions. And this is a continuation of that and would allow funding for another 20 individuals to be moved out of an institution and into the community. There's an additional $13.8 million for home and community-based services to an additional 100 individuals on the wait list for the consolidated waiver and the emergency wait list for the community living waiver. And there is $1 million to reduce the number of children and youth and out-of-home placements triggered by homelessness, housing instability, or inadequate housing. And that's another area that has really been affected by the pandemic. I think probably the biggest, best news on the human services side is a significant increase of $87 million in federal funds to try and bring some balance to rates for the Child Care Works program, to provide a better balance between private providers and providers who are providing services to families that are being subsidized. As I mentioned, there are direct care worker training dollars and the new outcome incentives to encourage expansion of independent living and reduce costs of residential services. That is supposed to actually save over $800,000 in the 21-22 budget. And we have 3.8 million in 10 counties and municipal health departments that, and there will be a new health department in Delaware County in Pennsylvania. And one of my frustrations is right now vaccinations is sort of top of mind for everybody, and everybody's saying, well, look what a wonderful job West Virginia did. Well, the reality is West Virginia has a county health department in every single county. We have 7, and we're about to add 1 in Delaware County. So we, really had an infrastructure problem there as well. In terms of the Office of Developmental Programs, which provides services through DHS for people with developmental disabilities, the ID community waiver is up about 10%. The ID community base program is up about 7.5%, and autism intervention and services are actually down about 3.4%. And I know there has been a real controversy about some of the changes that are being made in terms of what it's going to cover with that. The community health choices waiver is up almost 24%. Long-term care for nursing facilities, and we have a huge problem right now with nursing facilities because of COVID and the fact that there has not been an increase in the Medicaid assistance rates for, I believe, 7 years. Our nursing homes are really in a difficult position. And in the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, actually, I was kind of surprised that mental health didn't get more. There's they're up just a little over, I believe, 0.2%. And for behavioral health services, they are level funded. Medical assistance transportation, which is really important in terms of people being able to get to the services that they need for MA, is up 2.6%. Homeless assistance is level funded. The CHIP program is up 17%. And I wanted to check on housing because I know that's going to be a huge issue with anticipated evictions due to COVID. And there's a $569.8 million federal funding line item for housing that is assumed in the DHS budget. So that is, boy, there's just so much more here. But I think that gives you sort of an overview of some of the things that are doing better, some of the things that are doing worse, and some of the things that are going to be very aspirational in terms of the work that we have to do to get the legislature to work with the governor to try and come up with a budget that is going to help more people. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Morgan. So I remember my first year here trying to wrap my hands around the human services budget, and it's difficult, it's complicated. But the one nice thing about it, in a lot of line items, it almost identifies the people who are going to be benefiting. 700 people with intellectual disabilities, a couple thousand kids who are going to be moved off waiting lists. It's all good stuff. I think it's really important. I'm going to talk about taxes, the thing no one else wanted to talk about, but I actually enjoy talking about. And I have one key message, which I think may be the most important takeaway from this whole event. There is no general tax increase in this budget. Let me repeat, no general tax increase in this budget. The governor's opposition to the legislature is already screaming and hollering, saying, governor's raising your taxes. Well, for 40% of Pennsylvanians, taxes are going to go down. And for another 27% of Pennsylvanians, taxes are going to stay exactly the same. Only about a third of the Pennsylvanians in the households and families that are doing best, who have actually seen their incomes go up even during the times of COVID, and are saving a lot of money, and they're seeing their stock portfolios go up, they're going to pay a little bit more, and it's not that much more. And this effort to make our taxes much fairer and to raise more revenue is critical for a couple of reasons. One is we have one of the most unfair tax systems in the country. Right now, people in the middle of our income scale and at the bottom pay taxes to state and local governments at twice the rate of people in the top 1%. Top 1%, people with an average income of about $1.5 million a year pay 6% of their income in taxes. People in the middle with an average income of about $60,000 pay a little bit more than 11%. And people at the bottom 20%, making less than $23,000 a year, they're paying just even a little bit more than that. So this is a important, but it's in the ultimate scheme of things, just one step towards making our tax system a lot fairer. Just to give you an idea of how many people and how will not be paying more taxes, the personal income tax rate will go up to 4.49% effective July 1st, 2021. But the tax forgiveness proposals will increase as well. And that means lots of people who are paying taxes now will be paying less. A single person making $49,000 or less will get a tax cut. If that person makes $15,000 or less, they'll pay nothing. A married couple making $64,000 or less will get a tax cut. If they make $30,000 or less, they'll pay nothing. A single person with 2 kids making up to $69,000 a year will pay less. And a single person with 2 kids making $35,000 or less will pay nothing. A married couple with 2 kids making $84,000 or less will see a tax cut. If they make $50,000 or less, they will see their taxes go down. This is a really powerful proposal because it makes our tax system fair and also raises about $3 billion in new revenues, which is important for 2 reasons. Number one, about half of those new revenues, it's about $2.9 billion from the personal income tax and $200 million from corporate net income tax reforms goes to education. That's about $1.6 billion going to education. The other half is necessary to balance the budget at a time when we've seen revenue shortfalls because of the COVID pandemic. These additional funds are necessary to ensure that we don't have cutbacks in the rest of the budget. So this is important, not just for education and not just for tax fairness, but to avoid cuts in many areas of the budget, which, to be honest, if you look at the budget as a whole, is not goodies budget. It's a pretty limited increases in the budget in very few areas. It's still something along the lines of the austerity budgets we've seen in the last couple of years, with the big exception of education and some of the critical human service funding areas that Morgan talked about. While we're talking about taxes, I want to talk a little bit about other revenues. The budget does assume that there's a modest economic recovery in Pennsylvania in 2021 and 2022. How fast that economic recovery happens, of course, is uncertain. Much will depend on whether we get another stimulus program coming from Washington. If we don't, we may see revenue shortfalls, and that could throw this budget out of balance. but the governor's not making wildly optimistic assumptions, and that's a really good thing at this point in the process. Also, the budget assumes $2.6 billion in the continuation of federal funds to offset the cost of Medicaid, or what we call medical assistance in Pennsylvania. It's also not totally certain. We think it's going to continue. We believe the Biden administration intends for it to continue, but at some point we may need to see legislation from Congress to ensure that it does continue. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say right now about taxes and revenues. And so why don't I stop and see if there are any questions?
If anybody has any questions, they can feel free to unmute themselves or put their question in the chat box.
Someone monitoring Facebook Live to see if there are any questions there?
I can hop over there.
Thanks.
One of the things I will throw in about medical assistance is that there has been an increase in enrollment because of COVID. And right now, while the emergency declaration continues, they can't kick people off of medical assistance. So we now have, I think, 3.13 million people in Pennsylvania who are on MA. That is, I think, roughly 1 in 6 in the state. And it is just an incredible lifeline for low-income people, particularly now. There also has been an increase. We switched to a state-based insurance exchange on January 1st because we figured actually we could save something like $30 million a year if we administered it rather than the feds. And there has been an increase in enrollment through that, I think, of like 175,000 people. It's called Penny, and that is, sort of another option, particularly for people who may have lost their jobs and lost their health insurance. That is just sort of something to keep in mind in terms of what is happening with medical assistance.
Thanks, Morgan. And I will add that while we're talking about healthcare, the governor's proposed a health value initiative that should help us save money and provide better care. It's very complicated. We're not going to go into details here, but we will be doing something from PBPC on it sometime soon. There are a couple of questions that I'm going to talk about or raise. One is someone's asking how much is going to be allocated for the new community college in Erie. Does anyone know? I have not gotten to that line item in the budget yet. I don't know. We'll look that up. Another person asked, does the revenue include money from the legalization of marijuana? My quick look at the revenue sources, I did not see that, although it might be included in the Liquor Control Board revenues. I wouldn't expect a huge jump in revenues from the legalization of adult use cannabis in the first year. The experience of other states that have done it is that it really takes some time to roll this out, particularly if, I almost said to roll it up in a new system. Particularly if you do it right, if you ensure that everyone who should have an opportunity to take part in this new industry can do so. But we have projected, I think, between $300 and $400 million in new revenues in a full year once this is set up. Let's see. There's a question about the uniformity clause on the personal income tax exemption. For those who don't know, the uniformity clause in the Pennsylvania Constitution says that taxes on any class of income have to be set at the same rate, but it does include what's called the poverty exemption. So you can reduce taxes for people with low incomes. And I believe what the governor's proposing is that this new tax forgiveness, expanded tax forgiveness program, which has always been justified in terms of the poverty exemption, can be expanded under that same proposal. It's possible there will be constitutional questions about this. We will see.
Mark, there is a question here regarding the fair funding formula and if the education funding would be administered through that. Is that something that Susan could address?
Yes, Susan.
You're on mute, Susan.
Sorry about that. So the investment directs all existing basic education funding through the basic education fair funding formula. Then it adds in a $1.15 billion adjustment so that school districts, no school district ends up losing money. So it's not like some kind of Hunger Games where you're taking from one set of school districts to give to another. It puts all the existing funding through the formula and makes everybody whole. And then on top of that, it adds $200 million that is distributed to all 500 school districts through the basic education funding formula. So everybody comes away as a winner. And I think that's really important because any proposal, so education funding in Pennsylvania is just grossly inadequate. We have a school funding lawsuit that's going to be going to trial in the upcoming year. A study that one of their experts did found that we have about a $4.6 billion gap between what is spent right now on students and what needs to be spent in order to have adequate funding. And so the idea that you can take this little tiny pie of funding that we have in Pennsylvania and just redistribute it via the formula, and that's going to make equitable and fair funding for school districts is just wrong. So this is a really enormous, as Morgan said, I mean, this is a huge, huge investment that we are just thrilled to see that Governor Wolf is acknowledging the problems that we have with school funding, and that we need this investment, and we can't start looking at school funding as a Hunger Games where we're going to take from some poor kids to give to other poor kids, because that's what it would be. So keeps everybody whole, gives everybody an increase, and many, many of these dollars are directed to school districts that have the greatest needs. So the school districts where we've seen the newspaper story after newspaper story where kids don't have computers, where they can't go back to school because there's asbestos and lead in their classrooms, or the classrooms are too crowded so they can't bring kids back. You know, I mean, kids don't have broadband. These are the kids who've been hurt for so long. Many of them are children of color who have just been, losers in the school funding system for decades, beginning to make a step toward remedying that and getting everybody, starting to get people more funding that they really need in their classrooms.
Thanks, Susan. I see another question in the chat about changes to the budget going to state police and local police departments and prisons. I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to dive that deeply into looking at those changes. I do know the governor is again proposing that local communities that rely on the state police for local policing pay something towards the cost of that, which I think is fair, particularly when you think about cities like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and others, and even some small communities that raise funds locally for the local policing. We have a chart about prisons, money going to prisons. That is one of our old standbys. You can find it on the page I posted, which has a lot of really useful background information on the budget, including an overview of how we've been spending or not spending enough on education, higher education, and other areas. What that chart shows that we actually spend way more on prisons in this state than we do in higher education. And that's been a trend that's continued for some time. There was a point at which we've spent more on higher education, but we're spending much less on as a share of the economy on higher education than we did in the 70s and 80s, and way, way more on prisons. One of the things I've always said is before I leave this job, I'd like to start seeing that reversed, because those two things are connected. When we don't spend enough on education at all levels, when we don't give people opportunity, you drive people to crime. And we need to reverse that. I can't tell you how much, whether that's available now, whether that's taking place now, although the governor has invested more in higher education in the last few years. And the Nellie Bly Scholarship Program would put $200 million into funding for to enable high school graduates and others to get advanced education. It's not enough. We have a proposal called Pennsylvania Promise. That's a $1 billion proposal that would vastly expand access to higher education, but it is an important start.
Mark, I'm looking at
Yeah,
the chart.
yes.
And the percentage of the budget, this is from the House Democratic Appropriations Committee. And I want to give them a shout out because they always do the best analysis of the budget. And, you know, go to their website and there's an amazing amount of information there. But according to them, the 21-22 executive budget, 4.7% is for higher ed and 7% is for corrections and parole. So there's a, you know, significant gap between what we spend on higher ed and what we spend on corrections and parole. But I also think what we don't spend on education very much contributes to what we spend on corrections. And actually, there's some really good information in the HDCC stuff on, you know, what the situation is with crime and delinquency. And we have a higher incarceration rate than many countries in Pennsylvania.
Yes, we do. Thanks. That's a really good question, and we'll be saying more about that soon. Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank our panelists, Reesa Kossoff, Morgan Plant, Susan Spicka, for joining us today, for the insights into the state budget and Governor Wolf's proposal. I want to express our support from PBPC side for that proposal. There's a lot of great initiatives we heard about today. We're going to have to all work to make sure that the General Assembly embraces as many of them as possible. But it's good to see that the governor is echoing some of the things we've been talking about for a long time about the need to make Pennsylvania a place that works for everyone and breaks down barriers of class, gender, race, and immigrant status. So thank you all and have a good day, everyone. Take care.
All righty. Thank you, Mark.